know. I'm not the fire expert, but what I've seen here in the past is that wood becomes pretty punky pretty quick. And it doesn't carry a fire as flashy and as intense as something with needles. We try to get rid of what we can, but again, you know, you can't log with sky cranes. You gotta have something, have a place to get stuff to. The material goes bad very fast, especially a lot of this elevation is ponderosa pine. When ponderosa pine dies, borers get in pretty quickly. And a borer only gets in a tree after it's dead. In this part of the country, you hardly ever see them attacking green trees. But if you walk through this fire, even within a month after it burned, you could start seeing the frass coming out of the trees like sawdust. You could hear them actually munching. And it's those flat-headed borers already working their way into that material. And what happens, what's bad about the borers is they go straight into the wood. And so after too long, mills don't want it. So usually if you miss an opportunity within the first year, 2 at the max, you're done. That wood isn't any good to go to any kind of sawmill. It's okay for firewood, but and that's different for elevation. If you have higher elevation, you're Doug fir or spruce, sometimes that wood's good for 5, 6, 7 years. But not in pine. Mary?
How can Canada get it wood down to Arizona cheaper than it can come from an immediate area? I just don't understand that.
Well, one of the process that we go through for selling commercial timber is we market in advance, we cruise it, which gives us a volume estimate, and then we have a mailing list of all the operators that want to buy wood. We send them a bid package. We have a bid date 30 days after we send it out, and they have to bid on it. Okay, so that's going to cost them money. Okay? We don't pay them to log it. They pay us for the material. And then there's all the work involved. And of course, they have the same work. And I haven't talked to them. The only stuff I've seen is what I've seen on the internet and other things. But the government up there does subsidize logging, so they get like big blocks of land. It's not like it's private land, but it's that logging company's land to do it. You know, there's still some regulation involved, obviously, but it's real different than how we do it here.
So the high volume that they have, big tracts of land, lots of trees, accessible.
Yeah, probably.
It's more economical.
Yeah. Now they're having a lot of problems up there too. The drought's affecting just about everybody, and Canada's been losing lots of trees to beetles, and they've been hitting that pretty hard. So it doesn't take much of that to flood a market. Also, you know, we're just can't. That's even happening in Colorado. There's been a lot of mills struggling because they started selling tons of beetle-killed lodgepole pine and spruce, and after about 5 years, nobody wanted any more of it. In fact, we had contracts going up there, and it's really hard to get out of a Forest Service contract for a timber company. And there was a policy passed just for the state of Colorado that all they had to do is come into a Forest Service office to see somebody like me and basically turn their contract back in and say, we're walking away from it, which isn't good either. So the market was real strong for a little while, and then kind of collapsed on itself. Most of those logs were going to log homes. So so they could use smaller trees. They didn't have to be perfect. They were basically just turning them, you know, from one size and selling them. Yes, sir.
What are the homes selling for now? What kind of gift do you get for, whenever you put up a timber sale? What does the operator have to pay you?
That depends. We have a process where we appraise each sale, depending on where it's at, what kind of wood's in it. There's a base rate that we can't sell it for less than. I usually, and they have to cut down to a certain diameter. So when we mark commercial timber, it starts at 9 inches. That's a tree about this big around. And it goes up to 24 inches, even greater in some places, okay? The trees with the most value, of course, are the bigger ones, all right? So depending on what that cruise came in, what that volume estimate is, I have a really good idea of the tree sizes and species that we're gonna be selling. And I do appraisal on that. What I don't do is I don't appraise anything less than 12 inches. So what I've done is I've made it a fixed rate at $1 a CCF. That's $1 a 100 cubic feet. And there's 800 cubic feet on a log truck, if it gives you kind of a visual. So there's 8 CCF on a log truck. That sounds pretty cheap, doesn't it? In fact, I sell firewood for about 5 times that much, even at $20. So we sell the wood fairly cheaply. Of course, then they have to bid it up. Now that's just the 9 to 12s at $1. The base rate for the other species is $3 for fir and $6 for pine. Okay, that's still pretty reasonable. That's still cheaper than what you can buy firewood for. So that's not the rate that's killing them. And these guys, this isn't a real competitive area. At the most, I'll have 3 guys bidding against each other. They never drive the price higher than about $7 a CCF. Because there are other costs are what's killing them. It isn't the cost of buying the timber. And that's so much different than the 80s. In the 80s, we were selling timber for $50, $60, $70 instead of $3. Right? Yeah, the markets are so much different today than they used to be. The big thing, though, to take back with you is one thing that I was really glad to see is when the 2 bigger sawmills shut down, especially the one in Alamogordo the first time, they had about 4 subcontractors working for them. And we really didn't want to see those guys go out of business. So we really sat down with them and said, you know, what can you guys do to keep the business? All these guys are loggers. They want to be in the woods. They don't want to be sawmillers. None of them want to work in a sawmill and make boards. But they've had to stay in the business. And they struggle with it. So there's a bunch of little sawmills around here right now. And some of the loggers will supply 2 or 3 of those sawmills, you know, keep them going. But it is a real challenge. It's a real challenge for us because we don't want to lose them as a tool, because once those guys leave, they're not coming back, and they provide quite a service for us. We wouldn't know what to do with those bigger trees. To us, thinning's thinning. It's from the smallest tree to the biggest tree, and they're just one of the tools that we use to accomplish that.
Mickey, I've heard lots of numbers. How many actual commercial sawmills are operating in New Mexico right now? Would you hazard a guess?
In New Mexico,
In New Mexico as a whole, as a state?
gosh, there's probably a dozen mills, I would say, left in the state. Most of them are small
And
operations,
those are
family
small.
operations. And probably half a dozen of those are in southern New Mexico. Actually, there may be, I don't know if there's much left in northern New Mexico.
Okay.
That's kind of sad too, because, you know, and then this does fit into the history of things. So one thing I didn't touch on is in '92, Spotted Owl was listed. Yeah, that's a good one to talk about. What that did immediately is most foresters didn't even quit trying. Most foresters disappeared from the whole country. They were looking for different jobs. And like this bad lady, and they were fighting. And that happened here also. What that did though, legally for the Forest Service, is there were some things in place where in the mixed conifer, one of the things in the recovery plan for the spotted owl said that anything that's mixed conifer is considered critical habitat. And there was only certain things we could do within critical habitat. One of them was, if we didn't know how much old growth we had left, we didn't have a good accounting on the whole forest, how much old growth we had left, like we had none. In doing so, it required us to leave what we call it basal area, and I'll just give you a number. It was 150 basal area we had to leave on the ground. Most of our commercial sales and our silviculturists try to cut our stands down where we're carrying about 40 to 60 basal area. So 150 basal area is still a very dense stand. It's almost so dense that you can't log it. You can't even get a piece of equipment through it, leaving the trees that dense, okay? So what we decided to do, as soon as we saw that, is we spent a lot of money collecting what we call stand exam information. And that's people going out and they put in plots all over the forest, and they're giving us that density information and size class information, species, everything, okay? We had a really strong program for about the first 4 years after the owl was listed. We gathered all this information because the one thing it said is if you can prove that 20% of your landscape is old growth, meets these definitions, you don't have to treat everything to that 150 basal area. Then you can kind of do some more things that you need to be doing. So we knew we needed that information, we got it, and then it opened us up to doing some other treatments again. But you know, that was a tough period for a lot of timber industry folks. In fact, another part of that was critical habitat was only in mixed conifer, so in pine country, you weren't restricted to that. So our program right away went to the lower elevation around the Lincoln, and that's where we logged for like 10 years. And that's harder in some of the places on the forest. Mescalero, if it was part of the forest, would have been an ideal place for us to go, because so much of their country has nice ponderosa stands. But the Cloudcroft district has very little. It's just it's an elevation zone, and that part of the mountain just goes like this, so it's a really narrow strip on the east and west side of the mountain. So it didn't last very long. I mean, our timber sales at the time, 100 acres was a big one, you know. So that's what the owl did to us. Now, one thing that's really nice about today is for about the last 10 years, there was a researcher that wanted to, you know, they're continually updating the science for the owl, what they need, that kind of thing. And I think they've always kind of known what they need, but they haven't had the science to support it, and they haven't had the treatments to support it. So one guy proposed a treatment in Mexican spotted owl habitat that would increase prey base, rodent habitat, basically. And man, we jumped on that. We were like, yeah, let's get the study done, and then it might have some really big impact for the whole region. And we're not protecting these 600-acre areas for each pair of owls. A lot of the forests in the region didn't even care about the owl being listed because they don't have a lot of owls. Lincoln National Forest has like 120 mating pairs times 600 acres. Man, we're working in between them, you know. So anyway, moving along with that whole project died like twice because it was going to cost a lot of money to do it, and we didn't have the money to support it. And it wasn't just a 1-year deal. It had to be supported for several years. And then the CFRP came around. You guys familiar with that program? It's only in New Mexico, Collateral Forest Restoration Program. So the good thing about that is we found somebody that works here, I think, Quentin Hayes.
Hey.
Quentin. So Quentin, with some help from some of our folks and some other people, put together a proposal on continuing with that original study. It got selected as one of the ones that they funded. It's being harvested as we speak. I love it. It's basically what they're doing is we're taking like 60-acre units, and we're putting these little patch cuts, you call them, we'll call them. Because one thing the rodents seem to really like is the edge effect from forest to openness, some woody debris on the ground, some more open country. You know, you get a good response with grasses and forbs, which rodents like. And the rodents are the prey base for the owl, so we're hoping this study's gonna say, look, these kind of treatments are good for the owl. And even if that's all we end up getting, and we don't treat the areas between the patch cuts, I'm tickled to death. It's, so far, we've moved through 3 of those areas, and the outcome's kinda nice. I mean, you can get swallowed up by trees. I mean, people like to see trees, but it's nice to see the openings too. And the way we're arranging these isn't just a square, they're a nice mosaic, the way they're being cut. And, I'm confident that we'll get good results from this thing, so, yes, ma'am.
Mary and I got to go on a field trip with Quentin, we're in one of his classes, and we got to go view the Scott Abel burn area. And what we saw and how he explained how good it was for the owls was that you have this big stand of mixed conifer, then you have this burn area, this edge where it's all burn area, and it creates this beautiful hunting area for the owls to come in for the rodents.
Right.
I mean, fire's not all bad.
Right.
You know, there are some things that come out of it that are good things.
Well, you know, in the whole vegetative management world, we know diversity is good. And one thing that really came out bad from the logging days is that a lot of country was basically clear cut. And so, you know, forests are pretty adaptive, they grew back. But all our forests now are about 80 years old, they're all the same age class, they're the same size, they're very dense. Something has to happen again. And so, you know, we don't want to just clear cut it again, we don't want to burn it all again, but we want to create these mosaics that make sense and replicate some more natural disturbance.
What would you, I think Ann had a question first.
I'm sorry.
So, well, you said thinning is thinning to you, so if you were to lose all these loggers, and you really said, forget it, you just cut the trees down, thin it, and walk away, or what do you do if that were to happen, if they just said, we can't afford to get your trees out?
My immediate response is no, we don't want to just cut out big trees and leave them laying around. I mean, we would continue with some kind of program and do as much as we can with the smaller trees that we can get rid of. But we've been in 20 years, we'd be in a real dilemma, yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of forests that are like that. There's a lot of forests where their programs died in the early 90s. And I'm thinking of the Carson, the Santa Fe, some of the northern forests. They had huge timber programs at one time, and they sell basically nothing anymore. They've got a real problem.
What do you consider a large timber sale now? You had mentioned 100 acres or something. It's not that
We
big.
develop our sales through who the operators are, okay? So when White Sands Forest Products was going strong, a timber sale could be 1,000 acres. And they could be pulling off, 3.5, 4 million feet pretty easily off something like that. When that happened, of course, the guys that are left are going, I'm not gonna bid on a contract that's that big. So right now, I set up contracts that are anywhere from 50 acres to 300 acres. I don't have very many of them that are over 300 acres. They're usually a 4-year term on those contracts. They're very challenging for the operator and the Forest Service because we have more than the spotted owl to think about when it comes to endangered species. A lot of those are timing restrictions. In fact, Dan was asking me just a little while ago how busy I am right now, and I was like, man, I'm busier than I am in the summer because the winter months, the loggers are going nuts because they're not shut down for some summer restriction for salamander, spotted owl, goshawks, and plant. Yeah, and and I'm not complaining about the restrictions, there's good needs for them, but they really make it challenging to log because these guys, they usually carry more than one contract at a time so that they can be versatile and move around on the landscape, which is also costly. They have to move in and out so often, but they make it work. Yes, ma'am.
How many sawmills in Lincoln County are there still operational?
In Lincoln County, I don't work with actually comes we have Loma Grande that wants to set up that mill. Frank probably knows more.
I think I only know two.
Sherry Barrow used to come to us she has the shaving plant.
El Molino. On the airport road, El Molino.
Yeah. I know that there's some small mills that mostly get their lumber off of private lands, and they're probably swamped right now. You know, I think everybody's getting wood. But I don't have any bidders that come into us for commercial saw timber like the other side.
Are there larger operators in the country that could be attracted to an area like this if they could get big enough contracts and long enough contracts? Or are they just not?
I don't think so. I think probably not. Another operator that you guys have living over here that has been doing a lot of work are the Jensens. They worked for Mescalero for a number of years. They're the ones doing the project for us on that MSO CFRP project. I don't see that ever happening here. And at this point, I'm not sure how we could even support them unless the whole MSO thing goes through and we make some big changes in our forest plan and we can open up some of those protected areas. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the burned logs from the fire, that people bought them. What did they do with those?
In this area, people do all kinds of different things with them. People carve bears out of them. That's one thing they do. There are, like I said, some smaller mills that can utilize some of that stuff. They don't want big chunks of it, but they'll buy a truckload at a time or something like that.
To make board.
Will make boards. That little mill at Loma Grande is making boards. And I think they plan on selling boards. They have quite a stockpile right now of logs sitting at that mill. One thing I didn't mention too is we had quite an extensive cable yarding operation here through the 80s. Actually, through about 97. White Sands Forest Products had a cable yarder. And I bet a third of their logging was cable yarding. They did quite a bit of it on the Sacramento district during the 80s. It's that X-Men. It's the cable going off a steep piece of ground with a piece of equipment at the top. I had a picture here of it, but a much bigger piece of equipment. They had a 1,500-foot reach on that operation, so they could log just about anything we could put up here. The challenge with that kind of operation is it's very expensive to do, and the layout has to be perfect. Roads have to be right in the right place. You have to put the roads right at the break of the hill between like the 30 and 40% ground. They have to be able to get that cable off the hill without the cable dragging the ground. So it's quite a deal to set up for cable yarding. The big thing, of course, was in the 80s it was economical. In fact, the very first thing they would tell us when we were laying out that kind of ground is they wouldn't even go into an area if you couldn't put up 8,000 board feet an acre. Right now, most of our sales are about half that. So they sure wouldn't be economic for that kind of operation. And of course, the markets sure don't support it. So cable yarding, I don't see cable yarding ever coming back in this country unless it's subsidized.
I have one question. My understanding during the fire was one of the restraints on getting anywhere was you had no access. So, and is that just because the train is difficult to get access to those different things?
You're talking the Little Bear Fire in particular? Well, remember where it started. It started in the middle of the wilderness area on very steep ground. Yeah, until you get to the ski area, there are no roads. Yeah, so all the firefighting, and that, that's not that uncommon across the West. There's a lot of wilderness areas, they get a lot of fires. We have a lot of aircraft that deal with that kind of stuff. Crews are flown in with helicopter. So
Are
they're
we
used to it.
trying to cut in roads in any of the areas that we just, because that was what they kept saying, was we couldn't get
Yeah.
into any place because there were no access.
Yeah,
Is that even feasible to do that?
Well, go in, they have to get special permission to use chainsaws and helicopters and stuff like that, so.
You know what's interesting about your comment though, is I remember 20 years ago that the Lincoln National Forest was really being criticized for having some of the densest road, the highest road density of a lot of forests in the nation. And at that time, I remember the number was 3.5 miles per section. And that was because of the logging. We were putting in a lot of roads for logging. And so there was a lot of decommissioning going on. There still is. People still think there's way too many roads on the Lincoln National Forest.
You mean decommissioning the road, like letting the road go?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Closing roads instead of opening more roads, basically. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Getting back to the spotted owl, you said that the spotted owl really affected the way that you could put out contracts for as logging and affected the way you manage. And I think I heard you correct that 100 pairs of spotted owl in the Lincoln National Forest, and you have to log 600 acres per. So, ever since the Endangered Species Act, we got put on the list, is that population grown to 100? And if so, I would think that that's what their whole desire is for it to grow. How is that going to affect you in the future as it grows?
No, that is a good question. That's a conversation we have our biologists quite often. The one thing we're really working on now is every time a new pair finds its little niche and they carve out 600 acres, the one thing they haven't been doing yet is taking away one of those when they're not finding an owl in it. And I think they're getting better at that. I mean, that conversation is definitely being talked about a lot more.
So they don't have a dot on there.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I think before that actually comes around, there's gonna be change in the whole recovery. There is a new recovery plan out right now, and it's not as restrictive. And in fact, in this CFRP project we're doing, I think is gonna go hand in hand and maybe move that a little faster to get us to be able to go into that 600 acres. One thing that they're not willing to do yet is that there's also a 100-acre nest core. And and you know what, I'm thrilled to death if we just leave that 100 acres alone, but we can do the other 500. You gotta bite off little pieces at a time if you can. But there are definitely good changes in the works.
How about biomass for energy as a use for?
We get contacted all the time. In fact, the two most recent, one was Fort Bliss. Fort Bliss and Holloman Air Force Base have been wanting to get off the grid from a terrorist standpoint. If the power ever goes down, they want to be able to have their own source of power. That makes sense, right? El Paso was the first one to try Fort Bliss, and they've had a lot of conversations with us on what we could provide. The one at Fort Bliss actually was going to do most of their generation from waste material from El Paso. But they wanted a stockpile supply from the forest. It's been a few years since we started talking to them, but I think it was like 50,000 tons a year or something like that they first came to us with. And that was just an emergency set aside. We were like, wow, that's kind of a crazy number. Don't know if we can do that or not. But, and then they were gonna burn that once a year just so they kept reestablishing this emergency stockpile every year. It's quite a bit of material though, especially if that's not their major source of creating energy. I haven't heard anything about that project in 2 years now. I don't know where that went. Then all of a sudden Holloman got on the bandwagon and they wanted to do it. Of course, they're a little closer, so Holloman wouldn't be as far. And you probably know Sharon more with what's happened to that than I do.
That's still I think it's still, it was on the table, it was off the table, it was back on the table. I think they're still looking at the feasibility of that. The Department of Defense has been mandated to supply, get off the grid basically, a certain percentage of their bases by 2025. So they're all looking at renewables, wind, solar, and wood. And with Holloman, I think they were leaning more towards solar, which makes a lot of sense for them too, because they have an awful lot of that there, and it's cheaper than hauling wood to them. So it's the economics, and I think they're still trying to see what the feasibility is. They're looking at all different kinds of options, but I think biomass is still on the table.
I think water was one of the big issues, because they needed water for their process.
Yeah. And of course, another challenge for us is that